This is Background Nippon. There is nothing here that needs your attention. What follows is Japanese history, told slowly for the end of the day. The lanterns are lit. In the mountains of Gunma Prefecture, at the end of a narrow road that passes through rice paddies and cedar forests, there is a red brick building that is longer than 200 meters. It does not look like something that belongs here. The brick is the color of dried blood, French pressed clay, fired in the 1870s. The roof is tiled in the local style, but the form is unmistakably European. Tall windows in rows, a pitched roof, iron reinforcement in the walls. The structure says we built this knowing exactly what it was meant to do. It was meant to make Japan competitive with France and England and the United States in the one industry that Japan already dominated, silk. And it was meant to do something else, less stated but equally important, to teach a country of farmers how to be an industrial nation. Tonight we spend time with the mill, with the women who worked it, and with the particular moment in history that made it necessary. There is no rush. The looms are still. Settle in. In January 1868, the Emperor Meiji was restored to power, and the Tokugawa shogunate, which had governed Japan for 264 years, ended. The men who arranged this, young samurai from the western domains of Satsuma and Choshu, were not traditionalists. They did not restore the emperor in order to return Japan to some imagined ancient state. They restored the emperor because they needed a symbol of legitimacy around which to build something entirely new. What they were building was a modern state. By modern, they meant capable of surviving contact with Western industrial and military power. The context for this urgency was everywhere visible. China had been humiliated in the Opium Wars. India was a British colony. The Dutch held much of Southeast Asia. Japan had been forced to sign unequal treaties with Western powers, treaties that gave foreign nationals special legal status in Japan, that limited Japan's ability to set its own tariffs, that were, in diplomatic language, the structure of a relationship between unequals. The Meiji leaders intended to become equals. This meant industrializing, and industrializing meant money. Japan had one significant economic advantage in 1868: silk. Japanese silk had been traded since ancient times. The sericulture tradition, the cultivation of silkworms on mulberry leaves, the extraction of silk thread from cocoons had been practiced in Japan since at least the 3rd century CE. By the Edo period, silk production was distributed across hundreds of villages and small producers, spinning thread in a system that was artisanal, labor-intensive, and of inconsistent quality. But it was silk, and in the 1860s, Europe needed it desperately. Pébrine disease, a pathogen that attacks silkworm eggs, had devastated the French silk industry in the 1850s. Italy and other European producers had been similarly affected. Japan, which had been isolated from European disease vectors, was one of the few reliable sources of healthy silkworm eggs and raw silk. Exports from Yokohama, opened as a treaty port in 1859, went from almost nothing to enormous in a decade. By the early 1870s, silk accounted for roughly 1/3 of all Japanese export revenue. The Meiji government recognized what this meant. Silk was the engine that could fund everything else. The problem was quality. Japanese raw silk was produced by hundreds of small, independent households using varying techniques. The thread was inconsistent in diameter, inconsistently dyed, and difficult to use on the power looms that were standard in European silk mills. French mill owners who bought Japanese raw silk had to process it more extensively than they would have preferred. French silk could be fed directly into a mechanical loom and woven at speed. Japanese silk frequently had to be re-reeled by hand before it could be used efficiently. This was the technical gap the Meiji government decided to close. The plan was specific. Build a model factory using French technology and French expertise, produce silk of a quality that European mills could use directly, and use the factory to train a Japanese workforce that could spread the technique across the country. In 1870, the government sent a delegation to France. They contacted the Société Générale des Soieries, the major trade body for French silk. The French sent an engineer. His name was Paul Brunat. Paul Brunat was 31 years old when he arrived in Japan in 1870. He was from Lyon, which is the center of the French silk industry and has been since the 16th century. He had spent his career in the industry and understood both the technical processes and the commercial requirements. He was energetic, pragmatic, and apparently willing to spend years in a country that was almost entirely unfamiliar to him. The Meiji government gave him considerable authority. He was asked not just to design a building, but to design an entire system, the physical structure, the machinery, the training program, the labor practices. He would also supervise the construction and manage the mill's first years of operation. The location chosen for the mill was Tomioka, in Gunma Prefecture, north of Tokyo in the mountains where sericulture had been practiced for generations. The mulberry trees that silkworms require were abundant in the region. The river provided water for the industrial process. The site was large enough for what was planned. Construction began in 1871. The mill opened in July 1872. The buildings Brunat designed are in a style that has been described as French brick and Japanese timber. The walls are brick, made from local Gunma clay but fired in the French method, producing a dense, dark red brick very different from the softer regional varieties used in traditional Japanese construction. The roof structure is a French-style timber truss, supporting traditional Japanese curved roof tiles. The main reeling shed, the Higashi Mayakayasha, or East Silk Reeling Factory, is the most impressive structure, 140 meters long, with a row of tall windows on each side that flood the interior with natural light. The looms were arranged in rows running the length of the building, and the workers moved along the rows tending to the machinery. The French machinery was brought by ship from Marseille, loaded onto carts, and transported up from the rail terminus at the coast. The installation required French technical staff alongside the local workforce, and the first year of operation was partly an extended training exercise for everyone involved, including the engineers. The mill was, by the standards of 1872 Japan, an extraordinary building in an extraordinary place, European industrial architecture in a mountain town surrounded by rice paddies and silk villages. The mill needed workers. The plan was to recruit young women from sericulture families, daughters of the farming households who already understood silkworm cultivation and silk production, who could be trained in the mechanical reeling process and who would then return to their home regions to teach others. Recruitment was not easy. The mill was unlike anything that had existed in Japan. The French technical supervisors were unlike anyone most people in the region had encountered, and rumors circulated with the particular speed that rumors travel in small communities that were not reassuring. The French engineers drank a red liquid every day at meals. People who had not seen wine before concluded that it looked like blood. The conclusion they drew from this is predictable. The mill, it was decided, was a place where workers were brought to be consumed. The government's response to this was direct. They asked high-ranking local officials to send their own daughters first, as evidence that the mill was safe. The daughter of a local magistrate named Wada A was among the first workers. She later wrote a memoir, one of the few first-person accounts of the mill's early years. The first cohort of 414 workers arrived in October 1872. Wada A was 16 years old when she entered the Tomioka Mill. She worked there for 3 years before returning to her home province of Matsushiro in Nagano. She later wrote a memoir Tomioka Nikki, the Tomioka Diary, that was published long after her death and has become the primary personal account of what the mill was like from the inside. Her account is striking for what it takes for granted. The work was difficult and the hours were long. The French female supervisors who taught the mechanical reeling were strict. The process of unwinding silk from cocoons in hot water was hard on the hands. But AI was also clearly fascinated. She writes about the French supervisors with curiosity rather than fear. She writes about the machinery with the interest of someone encountering something genuinely new. She writes about the food served in the workers' dormitories, Japanese food, not French, the government having decided this was important, with appreciation. What she does not write about is homesickness or misery. She was learning something. The learning was the point. She returned to Matsushiro and taught what she knew. Within a few years, her home region had established its own silk reeling operations using the techniques she had brought back. The plan was working. The workers at Tomioka lived in dormitories on the mill grounds. This was unusual and required specific design. The mill's dormitory buildings, still standing, are essentially traditional Japanese architecture, wooden, with sliding doors arranged around interior courtyards. The scale is large, but the style is familiar. The women who lived there came from different provinces and different social backgrounds. The initial cohort included the daughters of samurai families as well as farming households, placed in the same dormitory rooms, doing the same work. This mixing was, in the context of Meiji Japan, genuinely radical. The class distinctions of the Tokugawa period, samurai, farmer, artisan, merchant, each with separate social status, were officially abolished in the early Meiji years. Tomioka was one of the first places where the abolition was experienced in practice, a samurai's daughter sitting beside a farmer's daughter, learning the same skill, eating the same food. The dormitory system also served the government's purpose. Women who lived and worked together for several years formed communities. The skills and knowledge they shared were reinforced. When they dispersed to their home regions, they were not isolated individuals carrying a new technique. They were people who had learned together, whose understanding of the work was social as well as technical. Brunat brought with him from France a group of technical supervisors, including several women who would directly instruct the Japanese workers in the reeling process. The French women who came to Tomioka were in a situation as unusual as that of the Japanese workers. They were in a country where they did not speak the language, where the food and customs and social structure were entirely unfamiliar, where they were simultaneously figures of authority. They controlled the training, and completely dependent on their Japanese counterparts for navigation of daily life. The relationships that formed between the French and Japanese women at the mill are not well documented. What we know is that the work proceeded. The training was effective. The output of the mill, by any measure, met its quality targets within the first few years. Brunat himself left Japan in 1875 after 3 years. He was replaced by other French engineers. The mill continued under French technical supervision until 1883, after which Japanese managers took over entirely. The French expertise had been transferred. This was precisely what the Meiji government had intended. The model factory worked. Women trained at Tomioka returned to sericulture regions across Japan, Nagano, Fukushima, Aichi, Yamanashi, and established or advised new silk reeling operations. The techniques spread along social networks. A woman who had worked at Tomioka trained her neighbors, her relatives, the women of her town. Within a decade, mechanized silk reeling had spread to regions that had previously relied entirely on hand reeling. The quality of Japanese raw silk improved substantially and consistently. By the 1890s, Japan was the world's largest exporter of raw silk. By the early 20th century, Japanese silk accounted for more than 60% of global raw silk production. The silk industry employed hundreds of thousands of women across the countryside in small mills that replicated the Tomioka model at local scale. The export revenue funded what the Meiji government needed: railways, the navy, factories for other industries. The transformation of Japan from an agrarian society to an industrial one happened in a single generation, and silk was one of its primary engines. Tomioka did not do all of this, but it started it. The Tomioka Mill operated from 1872 to 1987, 115 years. This longevity is remarkable for an industrial site. Most factories of the Meiji era were torn down, rebuilt, replaced with newer structures as technology changed. Tomioka was different. The original buildings were solid and well constructed. The machinery was maintained and updated rather than replaced. There are photographs of the mill from the 1950s that look almost identical to photographs from the 1880s. The brick exterior unchanged. The tall windows unchanged. The women inside in different clothing, but doing recognizably similar work under the same roof. The mill survived the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, which devastated Tokyo and Yokohama but barely touched Gunma. It survived the Second World War. Tomioka was not a military target, and the mill continued operating through the years when much of Japan's industrial capacity was being destroyed. What finally closed it was economics. The global silk market had shifted, synthetic fibers had captured the mass market. The labor costs of silk production in Japan had risen far beyond what could compete with imports. In March 1987, the mill closed. For over 20 years, the mill sat empty. The Katakura Silk Spinning Company, which had owned it since 1939, maintained the site rather than demolishing it. The buildings were not in use but were kept structurally sound, a decision that seems from this distance obviously correct, but that was not obvious at the time. Empty industrial buildings are difficult to maintain. They are expensive to heat or cool. They attract water, rust, the attention of anyone looking for a cheap source of materials. Many sites from Japan's Meiji industrial heritage were demolished in the post-war and high-growth periods. Tomioka survived because Katakura held the property and because, gradually, the historical significance of the site became clearer and more broadly recognized. The local government began discussions about preservation. Historians and architectural scholars made the case for the mill's importance, not just to Gunma, but to the story of Japanese industrialization and the story of the women who were its labor force. The mill had a story that was worth preserving. In June 2014, the Tomioka Silk Mill and related sites was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. The designation covered not just the Tomioka Mill itself, but 3 related sites: the Tajima Yahei Sericulture Farm, the Takayamasha Sericulture School, and the Arifune Cold Storage Facility, together representing the full silk production chain that the Meiji government had built across Gunma Prefecture. The inscription was categorized under sites of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution, a broader recognition of the era in which Japan transformed from a feudal to an industrial society. UNESCO heritage listings are sometimes criticized as tourism marketing in disguise. In Tomioka's case, the designation genuinely changed the mill's situation. The attention brought funding for restoration. The buildings, which had been carefully maintained but not restored, began to receive the work they needed. The mill is now open to visitors. The main reeling shed can be walked through. The dormitory buildings have been partially opened. The machinery, some of it more than 100 years old, still in place where it stopped working in 1987, is visible. It is a remarkably intact site. The Tomioka Silk Mill is, among other things, a monument to a specific kind of female labor. The mill was designed and managed by men, by Brunat, by the Japanese government officials who conceived of it, by the male managers who ran it through its long life. But it was operated by women, the several hundred women who worked at any given time, drawn from the sericulture regions of Japan, were the mill's actual human substance. This was not unusual in the silk industry. Globally, the work of spinning and weaving has been associated with female labor since antiquity. But the Tomioka context is specific. These were young women, many of them from families of some status, who had chosen a new kind of work in a new kind of place, and who then carried what they learned back to transform their home regions. Wada Ai, who wrote about her experience, was one of thousands. Most left no account. What they left was the technique transmitted in practice in the small mills and sericulture cooperatives of rural Japan that made the country's most important export industry competitive with the world. The monument to them is the industry itself, the silk that funded the railways and the navy and the schools. When you walk into the main reeling shed today, the machinery is still there. The basins where cocoons were dissolved in hot water, the reeling machines that drew the thread from the cocoons and wound it onto wooden bobbins, the mechanical transmission systems, long shafts running the length of the building, connected to pulleys and belts, that distributed power from the steam engines to the individual machines. All of it stopped in 1987. Some of it had been running since the 1870s, repaired and maintained across a century of use. The preservation of industrial machinery is unusual. Most factories, when they stop operating, are stripped of their equipment before the buildings are dealt with. The decision to leave the Tomioka equipment in place was not universal. Some items were removed over the decades, but enough survived to give the shed the character of something that has simply paused. The looms do not operate, but they are there. The wooden bobbins are still on the racks. The belts that ran the machines are still in place, stiff with age. It is a kind of evidence, physical, present, specific, of how a particular thing was made in a particular place at a particular moment in history. There is a connection worth making. The silk that Tomioka produced, the reeled thread, wound on bobbins and shipped to mills in Kyoto and Kiryu and the other great weaving centers of Japan, became fabric. Much of it became kimono. The kimono is not a simple garment. The best Japanese silk kimono involves dozens of processes, the dyeing of thread in patterns that must be aligned precisely when woven, the weaving itself on complex mechanized or hand looms, the finishing, the lining, the application of embroidery or resist dyeing techniques. The Nishijin district of Kyoto, mentioned elsewhere on this channel, has been weaving silk since the 5th century. The thread that Tomioka standardized and made consistently available fed Nishijin looms for a century. The thread and the weaving are part of the same story. The Gunma farmer's daughter, who spent 3 years at the Tomioka mill and returned home to run a reeling operation, and the Kyoto weaver who worked the silk her operation produced, they were part of an industry that stretched, in the Meiji period, from the mulberry trees in the mountains to the fabric in the shop in Ginza. The revenue from silk exports did not go into the pockets of individual farmers or mill owners for the most part. It went through various mechanisms of taxation and government ownership into the Meiji project of modernization. The Tokaido Railway, running from Tokyo to Osaka, completed in 1889, was funded substantially by silk revenue. The development of the Japanese Navy, which defeated the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905 in the most dramatic naval battle of the early 20th century, was funded in part by silk. The new universities, the telegraphs, the postal system, the introduction of universal primary education in 1872, all of this had to be paid for, and silk was a significant part of how it was paid for. This is what the mill was doing in the mountain town of Gunma. Not making fabric, making a country. The women reeling thread in the shed, the French supervisors teaching them, the engineer who designed the building and sailed from Marseille to do it. They were all, whether they thought about it in these terms or not, part of a very large project. On a weekday afternoon in late autumn, the Tomioka Mill grounds are nearly empty. The tour groups that come in the summer and on weekends have gone. The gift shop is about to close. The light is flat, that particular grey of late November in the Kanto region, when the sun is low and the shadows are long even at midday. The red brick of the main building has darkened over 150 years. The mortar between the bricks is deep, the surface slightly irregular where frost and rain have worked at it over the decades. Inside the reeling shed, the machinery stands exactly as it did in 1987, which is to say almost exactly as it did in 1925, which is to say much as it did when it came off the boats from Marseille in 1871. The belts are dry. The bobbins are empty. The light through the tall windows is the same light that fell on the hands of the women who worked here. The building is quiet in the particular way of things that have stopped. Not abandoned, not dead, stopped. Waiting for someone to ask what happened here and why it mattered. The Meiji period lasted 44 years from 1868 to 1912. In 44 years, Japan moved from a feudal society that had been closed to the outside world for 2 centuries to one of the major industrial and military powers on Earth. No other society in history had made this transition so rapidly. Many things made this possible. The decision to adopt and adapt rather than resist. The willingness of the Meiji government to bring in foreign expertise and then systematically transfer it to Japanese hands. The particular quality of Japanese institutional organization, the ability to mobilize collective effort toward a defined goal, and the silk. The factory in the mountain town, built from French brick with French machines and trained French hands, running on the labor of hundreds of young women who came from farming households and who went home carrying knowledge. This was not the only thing that made the Meiji transition possible, but it was one of the first things. A specific, material, visible piece of the project. It still stands. The brick is still red. The windows are still tall. Somewhere in a drawer or a museum cabinet or a family's careful keeping, there is a length of silk that was reeled on those machines, in that building, by a woman who is long dead. It is very fine thread. It has lasted well. The lanterns are lit. Sleep well.